Is it one of those things where, seeing and reading Gillian Balagay's book, which I think is an incredible read in terms of just an insight into the mind of Pochettino, particularly during the 16-17 season. He is an emotional figure. He is someone that wants to connect with people. Is his greatest strength also his greatest weakness in the sense that relentless sort of approach drains people quicker than maybe others would?
Yeah, that's one shout, definitely. I do think, like you say, the emotional side is a big thing for him. He needs to feel loved and wanted and respected, and he expects the same kind of his players. It's like a two-way street, and he expects the same of the owners as well. And ironically, he and Daniel Levy had the closest relationship Daniel Levy's ever had with any Spurs manager, but yet it ended the way it did in exactly the same way. I mean, the fact that Pochettino lasted 5.5 years is like way over the average for a Spurs manager. It's just ridiculous. The average is about 18 months, I think, for a Spurs manager. So, yeah, I think there's an element of that. I do think there's almost, it's a bit of a cliche, but kind of burned so brightly in a way, burned himself out in the end. And the players weren't buying into it anymore because it's a difficult one because I really don't want to put it all on Poch. I think to say that the end of Poch's time was all Poch's fault is not fair, really, because he also had these really two horrendous transfer windows in that season when they reached the Champions League final. It was the summer before and the January one where they bought nobody. And it was a very odd time. He was confused. No one really understood why they weren't freshening up and strengthening this side. And ultimately, I think that was one of the biggest reasons for that era of Spurs falling apart was that they just didn't refresh until it was too late. And by the time they refreshed and they brought in a few people like Tanguy Ndombele, Lo Celso, both the players that Poch really wanted, Sessegnon, Jack Clark, unfortunately, didn't really do anything that summer, obviously, or after, although he's having a bit of a career renaissance, to be fair to him. Yeah, from that point on, you kind of felt, well, this is too late. And for Poch, it almost felt too late. And yeah, within, 3 months of the season, he was gone.
I think it does reflect maybe better on Pochettino what's happened at Spurs since.
Absolutely.
The years since haven't exactly vindicated that choice to let him go. I guess one other concern that has been brought up, and I think it's a very valid one with the way Chelsea season has gone, the new ownership, the list of sporting directors we've appointed. That relationship with sporting directors has been one of concern at its previous clubs. I mean, I guess firstly your experience with that, but then also what do you make of kind of Chelsea? Because it's not just one person he's dealing with.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting because this was always my concern with Poch was when he was going to Paris Saint-Germain and how different a club it was to the ones he'd been at before. You know, this is a guy that's been used to Espanyol, Southampton, Spurs. He's been used to places where he can build a very tight family-like unit. Everything is about that core, that family, and everyone outside is kind of it doesn't mean anything. And as soon as he went to PSG, and I was a bit like, oh, that's like a huge kind of beast of a club almost, with so many different people having input and into everything. And so it proved to be. I do think he struggled with that aspect of it. Ultimately, the key thing for Poch, and why it did work with some of the sporting director types they had directors of football at Spurs, was whether he could strike up a friendship with them. So he had Paul Mitchell, who he knew from his MK Dons. He knew from previously he dealt with him at MK Dons and stuff. I think maybe Southampton. I'm trying to remember now. But Paul Mitchell was definitely one that was a friend. Steve Hitchin, who started off as a chief scout and ended up kind of getting promoted up the levels to being a kind of a director of football, they were close friends as well. So as long as he had someone that was a close friend of his that he felt was his ally, I guess, with the board, that's the key thing. But then, yeah, he goes to PSG and it was Leonardo, and that was always believed to be quite strained, that relationship, and never really quite worked. Yeah, I think it's pretty much down to the word is interference. As if Poch is allowed to do what he does, build what he can build, and then the people around him are helping him do that, then he'll be absolutely fine. But if there's everyone having their own opinion and saying what they want and trying to influence matters, that's when you'll have issues. It's a difficult one because obviously I don't know Chelsea inside out like I do Spurs, but you would imagine Chelsea are at this point now where they've bought a lot of players. They've done a lot of things maybe they felt they should do rather than what the manager particularly wanted them to do. You would have thought that now is the chapter to actually you've gone all out to get Poch. You know, you've done the reverse of the usual. It's not a Chelsea manager going to Spurs, it's a former Spurs manager going to Chelsea. You've gone through all of that. Some, like you say, some fans not being happy with that. Surely you've just got to back him now and say, okay, you draw out your vision for exactly what you want. And Poch likes to work with quite small squads as well. So that's going to be very interesting to see how that works. But just essentially give him what he wants. And he's now got trophies to his name. I know people dismiss them because they're in the French league, but ultimately he can win. He knows how to win trophies. He's got over the line. Just let him do what he can do, because a happy Pochettino is a fantastic manager.
One of the things that is brought up, and we spoke about earlier, that ability to trust in young players, to connect with them, to then get those young players to run through brick walls. I mean, it's one of the things that I think stands out with this Chelsea appointment when we look at the investment in younger talent that the new ownership has made over the past 6 months at Chelsea. The likes of Benoit Badiashile, Wesley Fofana, Enzo Fernandez, Mykhailo Mudryk, Noni Madueke, the list goes on. Is that, because I see that and I think I can see a similarity of a young core that he had at Spurs being replicated there. Am I being too simplistic there? Because that's what I think is one of the biggest selling points of Pochettino's appointment.
No, absolutely. I think you're spot on. I think the Spurs' average age when he, in his first couple of seasons, was something like 23, 24. It was very young. What I would maybe slightly counter that with was obviously that was a different expectations at Spurs. He was obviously aiming to try to get into the top four, whereas obviously with Chelsea, you'd imagine, despite even with last season, the expectations are higher than that. So he was maybe able to not take more risks, but he was able to take a bit more time and patience, I guess, with these young players. You could argue that, with a lot of these players being brought in for big money by Chelsea, they're already of a higher standard, perhaps, and that could help him. Key thing for Poch with young players is they're more malleable, that he can mould them to exactly what he wants them to be. This is the thing. This is something, I guess PSG, in a way, was a new experience for him of every match being expected to win. You had to win every single game. And that, despite the fact that it probably wasn't the most successful period of his managerial career in terms of what he wanted to do with the players and the tactics and the coaching, obviously was in the silverware perspective, but not so much in what he wanted to do on the pitch. It might still bode well for Chelsea. It might have. He's now experienced both worlds. He's experienced with Spurs the slow and patient build-up with the young players, working with them. He's experienced an atmosphere where it was a win now, you have to do it. And maybe where Chelsea are at right now, it's not quite in the middle. It's probably still more veering towards the PSG end of things. But yeah, with these young players, with the level they're at, he could do good things with them. He really could.